There we are. I think we're recording now. Right on time. So, I was going to offer our meeting number, but what is this, number 6?
I'm not sure.
I think it must be something like
but
that.
But it is us beginning chapter 6.
That's
the first 2 sections of chapter 6.
Yeah.
The first section being called Changes, and the second section, the newcomer. And I've already forgotten. There it is. NAFTA. We met NAFTA today.
Mr. NAFTA, who I kept sort of confusing, at least orally, with that white gas fuel that you use for little camping stoves.
Yeah.
Naphtha.
Right.
So I doubt this is something that Mon wanted me to think of, but
No.
but yeah, we end with him. But we start off in a kind of a weird moment.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I think the little bit of talking we've done so far has led me to think you maybe feel the same way. I'm sort of back to my old complaints about the book again, and I think you know, in a way, all I have to do to explain my feelings is to point out that the beginning of chapter 6 is a sentence that says, "What is time?"
Right.
And this is just so fundamentally difficult in both in the genuine, like, oh, that's a big question way, and also in the sense that it makes for some fairly laborious reading, I think.
It's laborious reading, and I wonder if part of his pacing mechanism isn't like, I'm going to give you some big dramatic moments surrounded by lots of laborious, elaborate expostulations on the nature of seasonal change and time, and it is somewhat repetitive. The thoughts that he has to share about time in the Changes chapter aren't so different from other passages we encountered in the first 360 pages about time. Like, in some ways, it's like we're kind of saying the same thing over and over again. I do believe that is one of the issues that fattens this book in a way that is a little bit annoying. And it came on the heels of what I thought was a truly great dialogue sequence between Claudia and Hans. Like, Hans going overboard with the romantic gestures, Claudia trying to keep him in check. All of it being in French, like, that was interesting and weird and made you feel like, okay, now we're rolling. And then it's back to slowness. The first chapter, Meditations on Time and Space, the newcomer section, almost completely dominated by political, philosophical, and social debate between Settembrini and NAFTA. And you just know that you would hate to visit these guys or hang out with them.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying what they're talking about is unimportant. I'm just saying we all know guys like this.
I had this very guilty moment with that sequence at the end. Well, first, let me a sort of prosaic complaint first.
Yeah.
And I think this is on purpose, and I think I know what he's doing, but I don't think it works, or at least it's not worth it.
Yeah.
That rapid-fire dialogue without any sort of signal phrases left me feeling pretty disoriented.
Right. Like, who's saying what?
And I get it. It's supposed to be this sense of, how, Joachim and Hans are experiencing these two dudes just going at it.
Right.
And while I appreciate the gesture on some level, I just didn't think it worked. I was genuinely confused for portions of that about which person was, wait, what is he, for Rousseau or against Rousseau?
Right.
Which one is saying?
Well, and it was complicated by the fact, and I thought this part was sort of fun, actually. I think signal phrases would have made it more fun. But Settembrini does get busted being both for and against war.
Yes.
And he's trying to insist to the other 3 guys, no, they're not contradictory. They both make sense. Right. And the other guys are like, dude, like you're a revolutionary, but you're also anti-war. Like, you know, in the immortal words of Carol from Walking Dead, it's like, oh, sweetheart, you don't get both, you know.
Well, and my prosaic complaints aside, I will add, and this lines up, I think, exactly with what you're saying. I felt this kind of sharp dig of something unpleasant when it occurred to me as I was reading that this is perhaps how people are going to watch these videos.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
these two dudes kind of going back and forth about nothing.
Right.
Perhaps
Yes.
you know, or that, you know, a student might you know, you know, see the way that a professor talks in this way, but at the same time, I will own that there is a portion of that, and this is maybe the one redeeming quality of this week's reading for me is it leaned in. It was very oblique. You know, I would have really. I mean, I'm not a huge Henry James fan, but I would have preferred even a Jamesian treatment of this,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly more a sort of Flannery O'Connor treatment of this. But it leaned in a little bit on the sort of human foibles of some of these people, and we see this with Napta and Settembrini here,
Yeah.
where they're both so invested in being these men of big ideas.
Yeah.
But, as you point out with Settembrini, he's just so caught up in the argument, like the mechanism of argument,
Right.
that he doesn't even know what he's saying. And I've been there.
Yeah.
I remember, you know, painfully, I remember, you know, arguing in a meeting, in a Senate meeting years ago, about this sort of pedagogical change that I didn't approve of, and I was arguing against it. And a big part of it, I will freely acknowledge, was I didn't much like the people who were proposing this change.
Right.
And so I got so hung up in being the argument
Yeah.
that I literally, within the space of about 10 minutes, argued like contradictory positions, sort of almost in the same breath. I was just overwhelmed, overwrought,
Yeah.
angry, you know,
Yeah.
full of my own sense of
Yeah.
rightness,
Yeah.
and it was like a drug, you
Yeah.
know, and
Yeah.
it's sort of, you know, and so I think what we're seeing are these kind of little weaknesses. But my favorite version of that in this reading goes back closer to where we started for this time on 369, when Hans is meeting the Hofrat.
Yeah.
He now needs these injections,
Right.
vitamin or tincture or whatever it is he's getting, in the middle of 369.
Yeah.
And it's the first time they've bumped into each other since the carnival night,
Right.
and since Chachot has left,
Yeah.
and they're having this conversation about it, and they're remembering
Yeah.
when Joachim and Hans visited the Hofrat and saw his
Yeah.
paintings, and talking about Claudia.
And Hans is totally just fishing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? He's like, sorry.
Remember Claudia? Like, I don't know why I would bring her up.
Right. But the Hofrat kind of knows.
He does.
what's
They
going
all
on.
know.
Yeah, and I think what I see in this moment, right in the middle of the page here, I think is a little bit of a failure of poker face on the doctor's part,
Mhm.
where Hans is like, yeah, I mean, I really hadn't talked to her, but you know, come to find out, you know, I ran into her, we had a little time,
Yeah.
you know, and right in the middle, he says, you don't say, answered the Hofrat, right? He goes on, and then
Yeah.
the next paragraph, yes, went on the youth. I made her acquaintance.
Yes.
A thing that isn't so easy hereabouts, you know.
Yeah.
But Frau Chachot and I, we managed, at the 11th hour, we had some conversation. And I love this.
Yeah, like
You know,
he's just like,
you
it's
know,
no big deal.
Yeah. Well, the went Hans Kostorp and drew his breath sharply through his teeth. The needle had gone in.
Right, the
And-
doctor's probing him.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I think the doctor's mad.
Oh.
I think they're competing for Claudia's attention.
Yeah, I
You know,
think there's something
and-
to that, yeah.
And Hans is like, well, we bumped into each other at this party. We talked for like an hour, and outside of his visual range, right? The doctor's like, you know.
I don't know, it never occurred to me, that the Hofrat might actually be into her too. I'm so glad you brought that up. A lot of things click. I mean, of course I knew that he painted her.
Right, which is it's a thing.
It's an intimate thing to paint a woman.
I mean, I feel like we're verging on the conversation from the beginning of Pulp Fiction, but it's kind of like, well, would you paint another man's wife?
Right,
You know?
right. I think that's right. And I guess the reason that didn't click for me, and maybe people watch this are going to be like, damn, that's obtuse that it didn't. But it's just like so much of a big deal was made about others being into her, like the long-faced guy, the guy that visits her, like Hans himself and all the people. And it just seemed like the Hofrat, I guess I was still buying into him a little bit as this like grief-stricken widower who isn't really playing the game anymore. And I love the idea that maybe that's just a front that he's projecting and that he's back in the game in some way.
Yeah, I mean, there's something there
Yeah.
that feels like a something. And but the other great thing, right, is Hans is just undeterred, right?
Right.
He has this moment.
Reaction to the
Yeah,
shot.
reaction to the needle, and then he has to just comment on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Ooh, that one,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm reminded of I don't know. I think this is kind of a cult movie, but there's an old Chevy Chase movie called Fletch, classic sort of comedy, and he has to go undercover. I forget what the mystery that he's trying to solve. But he's like a journalist. And he's trying to break some story, and he has to go see this doctor undercover, and ends up getting a prostate exam.
Right.
And at one point, he kind of like it's clear in the scene that like this exam is going on like longer than you'd expect.
Right.
At one point, Chase's character's like, "Whew, you lose your keys in there, Doc," or something.
Yeah.
And so, Hans kind of, "Ooh, that was quite a nerve you hit, there," and the doctor's just kind of like, "Oh yeah."
Yeah.
And it has this kind of like 80s New York feel to me.
Yeah.
Just stabs him with the needle to shut him up, but he won't be shut up. He's like, he kind of complains about the needle, and then finishes with where he says, "There's that ellipse. Thanks, yeah, massage does it good." Still talking about the shot, and he goes, "Yes, we came a little closer to each other in conversation." He's like right back to Claude.
Right.
He won't be deterred.
Right.
And so, we see these kind of, and we see this is also the section of reading where Hans and Joachim have their, I'm going to say, minor falling out.
Something about Hans visiting with the other doctor.
He's getting analyzed.
He's getting psychoanalyzed,
Yeah.
and Joachim is upset about this for
Yeah.
reasons that I think got clarified in the second chapter when he makes the non-solipsistic, like, thank God, clear claim. We're not here to get wiser, we're here to get healthier.
Right.
And so he's upset, like, he seems to, it's interesting, he seems to share Settembrini's idea that it's important that they frickin' finish and go, right? And Hans is more along the lines of, I kind of don't mind it here. Like, he's digging it. And Joachim's pissed because the doctor keeps... I liked the language and changes. I can't... Oh, here it is. This is on page 376, where a lot of people are leaving, and they call them... The Berghoff emptied. Perhaps it was the oncoming spring that got in their bones and upset even the steadiest going. But at all events, the number of wild, unauthorized departures increased until the situation verged on the critical. I love this idea of leaving without the doctor's consent, including Claudia, counts as a wild departure. And Joachim wants to do a wild departure. He just can't seem to fully summon up the courage to get past Hofrat. And Hofrat, in that same scene where he gives Hans the painful shot, the ostensible conversation is not Claudia, but Hofrat trying to talk Hans into convincing Joachim to stay.
Right, he's supposed to. And Hans, by the way, is like, sure.
Yes.
He's not happy to do it.
And then the chapter ends with him going into, I always forget the other doctor's name.
Barons?
No, not Barons. The one who's psycho Krakowski.
Yeah, right. Barons is the Hoffman.
Yeah, like going into Krakowski's office.
Yeah.
Krakowski also had been talking about those phallic mushrooms, which I thought was super funny. I actually looked it up.
Yeah.
We actually have those kind of mushrooms that grow in and around our house sometimes that look like a penis. And I felt...
385, right at the end.
Yeah, when...
Joachim saw his cousin disappear into the half-darkness of Dr. Krakowski's analytic lair.
Right. And this is presented as some kind of a falling out, I guess, because Joachim wants everybody's eyes on the prize of getting healthy and getting back down to business.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, speaking of that, like Settembrini treatment of Hans, we've talked about this before. It's like, forget the girl, go be productive.
Yeah.
And he goes so far this time at the bottom of 371 with that kind of pursued Greek allusion where he says, well, engineer, how have you enjoyed the pomegranate?
Mm-hmm.
And then he explains the allusion. Hans seems a little confused. He says on 372, gods and mortals have been known to visit the netherworld, which nether is a nice little euphemism, often spoken of for like a women's nether parts. The nether world and find their way back again, but in that kingdom they know that he who tastes even one of its fruits belongs to them. And it just occurs to me that this is like Settembrini really doubling down like on, you know, and maybe it's Mon, I don't know, Mon's engaging. There is, I guess, a type of intellectual in this world who really looks down on affairs of the heart and love and sex and marriage. And I think Thoreau was kind of one of those people, to be honest, right? That sees it as a hindrance to the stuff that you're supposed to be out here doing. And it's an argument that he seems to be making. Like, you know, by pursuing Claudia, he's like consigning himself to this shadowy world where he will never be effective again. And I find that to be obviously an officious way of thinking, but it's certainly the argument he seems to be making, you know.
Right. Now, and part of what's going on here, more generally in this section, but specifically with Settembrini and Hans, right, is this is kind of a chapter of sort of problems, relationship problems.
Yeah.
Settembrini's not talking to Hans. Joachim's not talking to Hans. Krukowski is, but everybody's mad that Hans is talking with him.
Yeah.
Bear is mad that Hans is talking about Claudia.
Yeah.
Settembrini and what's his name, Napta are. I mean, I guess we're supposed to see this as a version of a healthy relationship.
They're friends.
But it sure looks like a bitter argument to me.
Yeah.
And kind of a dumb one at
Well,
that.
you get the sense since they live in the same house, this is probably all they frickin' do.
Right. And so I think you're right that Settembrini's issue, and to some extent what feels like, you know, I mean, granted, we're only halfway in, but to some extent the backbone of the book seems to be this question of like what to do with yourself.
Yeah.
And frankly, and maybe I'm being kind of a hypocrite here, but I think Settembrini's answer is just so ridiculously wrong.
Yeah.
And his own life is evidence of it.
Right.
You know, I actually wrote on the margins there in 375 when Settembrini says he's going to leave.
Yeah.
Right. He basically says, "I'm going to die anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not going to die here."
Yeah.
And in a way, right, this is very macho kind of Hemingway-esque kind of thing. You know, like, you know, go out with your boots on. You know, looking at the sky kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know that you know it's hard not to get behind in some contexts, but he's just going on and on. And he says he's gonna carry on the service of the cure, even as he left the Berghof. About his taking with him and continuing the great encyclopedic task, he set himself that survey of the masterpieces of belles lettres from the point of view of human suffering and its elimination. And I wrote in the margins, Jordan Peterson.
Right.
Because what this felt like to me was this sort of dangerously learned, but not especially smart person who is going to sort of like tell everybody in the world how to feel about everything, and not pause to think for a second about how ridiculous it is to claim this kind of authority about life.
Right.
You know, especially when, you know, I mean, who is this guy?
Right.
I mean, where's this big, you know, I mean, you know, if this were Barack Obama,
Right.
you know, or Angela Merkel, or even Salman Rushdie,
Right.
who came up to me and said, "Man, you're not doing it right.
Yeah.
I would pause.
Okay.
I would bare minimum pause
Yeah.
and be like, well, they would know what doing it right looks like.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
You know. I mean, if you know, something like that. But when this guy says you're not doing it right, you know, I'm like, well, so I'm supposed to be more like you,
Right.
and how's that a win?
Right.
You know, and so the kind of blindness of this is so maddening to me, especially because I think Mon wants us to at least, if not be on Settembrini side, at least kind of, you know, recognize something in him. And
I'm not sure about that. I don't know if Mon isn't complaining about a certain
Yeah.
type of person through the characterization of Settembrini. I mean, you know, I think he ends up looking so overtly like an asshole that the author has to be doing this on purpose.
He's aggrieved. I think this is why
Yeah.
I want to connect him to Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
He's got this sense of grievance with the world
Yeah.
that feels completely unearned.
Right.
And I can't remember if I told you while we were moving my in-laws and my brother-in-law was here helping. This book came up,
Yeah.
and his only comment, you know, he's ordinarily pretty laconic to begin with,
Yeah.
but my brother-in-law's only comment was just to shake his head and go, "Oh, Settembrini."
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you know, I feel like we're in some company here
Yeah.
in terms of that, but yeah, I feel like I didn't like him like when we first encounter him, and Joachim kind of keeps coming back to his early days.
Yeah.
Didn't like him.
Right.
Warmed up to him a little.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, no, you're just kind of bonkers.
Yeah.
You know you're arrogant, and the constant illusions. Like, I think it's kind of interesting that you know the book is written in a way that means you've got to keep going back to the illusions.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, just in the last few pages,
Yeah.
we got Dante, we got the Iliad.
Goethe again.
Yeah, Faust is all over it. You know, all the way to the title.
Right.
And you know, you got to do all this, right? And so on, and then maybe this is why I think that Mon at least feels some sense of something
Right.
valuable in Settembrini. But at the same time, I'm just sick to death. Like, if I had a friend, you know, who always dropped these little bon mots from, you know, the Inferno, I would stop having drinks with that guy.
Yeah.
You know, pretty
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, so would I. And I mean, well, another thing, speaking of the conversation between them, and you mentioned Joachim, I mean, when the guys go away, when Settembrini and have to go away, I'm sure this leapt out at you, and this was published in 1924, and I just wasn't quite sure what to do with this. They spoke several times of the Middle Ages. This is the top of 404. It reminded me the first day I came when Settembrini said there was a good deal up here that was medieval, blah, blah, blah. How did you like him? Joachim, who, the little man, not very much, though he said some things I liked, that about courts of arbitration, but I did not care for the man himself. A person may say as many good things as he like. It doesn't matter to me if he himself is a queer fish. And queer he is, you can't deny it. That stuff about place of intercourse was distinctly shady, not to mention anything else. And did you see the big Jewish nose he had? Nobody but Jews have such puny figures. I was like, what? Like that guy was like, damn, Joachim, like just straight up
Right.
trading in these stereotypes that are ultimately going to bury Germany in infamy forever.
Right.
And this is a relatively sympathetic character in the book. I mean, we're not meant to think of him as an asshole.
I mean,
I don't know what to make of this.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things about this book, right? I mean, German or not, it's an artifact of a moment where anti-Semitism was not impolite in
No.
in a lot of social circles.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even Hans' defense of him is like, well, you don't know he's Jewish. Chaldeans have noses like that
Right,
too.
right.
Which is, you know, like he might not even be Jewish.
Right,
is,
right.
Is the defense to
Is-
the anti-Semitism.
Yes, yes.
And so it's you know it's fairly awful, right? In this sense, I marked that same section, you know, in there.
First real anti-Semitic moment of the novel that I caught.
Well, it's
there
been-
may have been others that I just glazed over,
Well,
but that one was like very
yeah.
much.
yeah, I certainly wouldn't put money on some bet that I haven't missed some more oblique
Right.
or period specific bit of slang
Yeah,
that would be anti-Semitic,
Yeah.
but certainly this is. And buried in it is also a lot of isms, some classism and some gender stuff,
It's true, and he also makes some broad stereotypes about Germans and about Russians,
Right.
and in ways that I guess we're more forgiving of in 2022 than we are
Yeah.
about race.
Right. I mean, these things do just. I mean, you read a Hemingway novel, and this is just gonna
Yeah.
land
Yeah.
about the same way.
Yeah. From
Very
the 19
casually,
Yeah.
in that sense, and I mean the same way that if you went up to, some very rural part of, this country, you might not be, that far away from some comments like this,
Yeah.
over a Budweiser. So, I feel really torn on these, right? I don't wanna be caught making this argument, about, you have to consider the time.
Of course.
But at the same time, I think I do have to sort of frame this within, I have to sort of feel my outrage, but at the same time be aware of where this registers, in what, I always forget what we say, like 1919,
Yeah.
or thereabouts, and how that, how that's gonna play out.
Yeah.
Especially, I don't know, it just seems in such a place that it has been such an important feature of this Berghoff that it be cosmopolitan.
That's right.
But not that way. That
Maybe not. I mean, I guess we haven't met any Jewish characters, have we?
Right. Well, I mean, presumably.
Except for maybe NAFTA. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, presumably some of those Russians were. Presumably
Yeah.
some of these Germans are.
You would think.
I mean, this was not like such a minority.
Right.
But I don't know. It is a weird moment. I think some of that is just the effect of reading in the 21st century.
Yeah.
But it clearly stood out. And this encounter, I think this is a kind of an interesting moment, right? That they watch this argument between NAFTA and Settembrini, and then they have to kind of debrief.
Right.
Right. They have to be like, what just happened
Right.
there?
Which is normal.
Yeah.
And I
the
appreciate
kids,
it.
The kids are having this conversation.
Yeah.
Afterwards, but then Hans tries to sort of pull rank, right? He's like, I've done that course of reading. Like, let's not forget.
Yeah.
It felt very much to me like the second year TA,
Yeah.
telling the freshmen, how it is, but but he even kind of leans into this Settembrini thing by quoting Tennyson.
Yeah.
Right? And Joachim gives him, what I think you rightfully identify as his prime directive, right in there 404. We came to acquire health, to get healthier and healthier until we are entirely well and are free to quit and go down below where we belong.
Yeah, like he right before that, he had said, that's where he said the
we didn't come here
line.
to acquire wisdom.
We didn't come here to acquire wisdom, so.
Right. Joachim's like, I came to chew bubble gum and get healthy.
Yes, yes.
But then Hans's response, right, of old sat freedom on the heights.
Right.
And I think, first of all, like what an incredibly kind of rude maneuver here to kind of like throw this like high culture encoded illusion that's like 3 layers deep at this guy who Hans has every reason to understand wouldn't get it.
Right.
Which, by the way, like it's been a solid 5 minutes since Hans even knew this stuff.
Right. Right.
And he's completely just sort of pulling rank with this.
Yeah.
He's just completely being like the older sibling or whatever.
Right.
Who's like, well, you don't know. Like when you're 18 months older, like I am.
Yeah.
And I find that it's just not very likable.
Yeah. Agreed.
In the sense, and so right now I feel like we're supposed to kind of side with Settembrini's idea that they should go down below, that they should get well and leave, that we should side with Joachim, except we don't like Settembrini, And this comes on the heels of Joachim just being like a flat out racist anti-Semite.
Well, and, again, like, I think that, I don't know, maybe we disagree on this. I don't think we do. But I would say that, one of the big arguments of the novel, and the novel might be contradictory, but it seems to me that, like, I can sympathize with, well, you said a couple of videos ago that, like, all things told, things were a little different. Maybe you'd move into one of these places. Right. And so, like, I'm not so sure that the novel is overwhelmingly arguing that they need to go back to town. I mean, I think, we're supposed to see this as maybe an opportunity for growth. It's certainly the first opportunity he's ever had to fall in love. He's already gotten that from being there. Yeah. He's made real relationships here, whether we like Settembrini or not. You get the impression he never had that kind of complex back and forth, mentor, dislike, all the complexity. Even the relationship with the Hofrat seems deeper than anything he's ever had before he got up there. So, I mean, I think...
he's an orphan. I think this is an important thing to keep in mind.
Yes. Part of what makes the novel, I think, complex is you're continually asking yourself, should they stay? Right. Or should they go? Is it preferable up there than it is down? And I said to you on the phone like a month ago, especially when I look at the state of the world, and I don't think I'm alone here, there are times where I'm just like completely sympathetic to those who do everything they can to check out. Vote, they don't read the news. Like, Hans keeps making a big deal out of how I don't read newspapers, and Settembrini like, what? And I don't know, man, I gotta tell you, like, as somebody that follows the news all the time, I can kind of see why somebody would be like, you know what? Like, what good has any of this really done any of us? And instead, just find some, like, I hate to sound libertarian, because I'm not, I'm not. But, like, the world is what it is. And maybe just getting a freaking cabin and getting away from everybody and everything, like, it feels like manna from heaven to me sometimes.
Yeah, well, and I think there are ways to sort of conceive of that don't even have to be libertarian, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, it is a reality of our situation that, you have to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And oftentimes what that looks like is stepping away from that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think, a neat sort of thing within the same conversation is this final sort of exchange just before the end of today's reading with Joachim and Hans, where Hans is sort of trying to pull this rank. He's trying to be the learned,
right.
Cousin. And he drops this Tennyson reference, and then he starts speaking French.
Yeah.
And I love, that Joachim just calls him on, just flat calls it on. He pulls back the veil. He refuses to play the game, right? And he just says, "Why do you suddenly begin talking French?"
Right.
What's up with that?
Yeah.
And Hans is trying to kind of maintain this identity of his, right? He's the guy who 2 years into college has grown his hair long and wears a beret.
Yeah.
Right? And he's like, oh, I don't know. The atmosphere up here is so international. I don't know which would find more pleasure in it, Settembrini for the sake of his bourgeois world republic, or Napta for his hierarchical cosmopolis. Right? I mean, he's just right. And then he says this thing that sounds a little bit like what I tell my students sometimes when I'm sort of engaging with them about the ideas of the humanities in general. He says, as you see, I kept my ears open, but even so I found it far from clear. On the contrary, the result was more confusion than anything else. Mm-hmm. This is the point, he says, right? It's like those students who think that they're on your side, and they're like, yeah, man, I won't be in English because you don't have to get a right answer. You can say anything. Right, and I always cringe a little because I'm like, you're close.
Yeah.
I'm uncomfortable with how close that is to true, but it's not actually true.
Right.
But then Joachim kind of drops some wisdom right here. Right, it always is. Right, more confusion than anything else. You will find that when people discuss and express their views, nothing ever comes of it but confusion, confusion worse confounded.
That really leapt out to me too.
I tell you, it doesn't matter in the least what a man's views are, so long as he's a decent chap. The best thing is to have no opinions and just do one's duty. Now,
And what do you think about that? Because I think that is a really controversial. Like, I almost feel like Thomas Mann could have just written that paragraph, and then everybody would have thought about it for the rest of the time.
I'm
after
imagining
he
Mike
died.
Myers going,
Yeah.
discuss.
Yes,
You know?
yes, yes.
But well, a couple things leap to mind here, right? I mean, the obvious thing, right, is I think we can draw a straight line from this to Nuremberg,
Yeah.
right? I was just doing my duty. I was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
following
Yeah,
orders,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right? So no, you can't just be a decent chap and do what that distinction, the same way that I think this novel is arguing against this kind of mind-body split.
Yeah, yeah.
And the same way that it's, I don't know, arguing against or for, but engaging with this Rousseauian, like, natural human versus social human idea, I think it's also sort of engaging in this idea of, finding answers versus living in the world, in that sense. You know what this really reminds me of, and it's a bit of a stretch, I'll acknowledge, but it feels a lot like those moments, those quiet moments on the raft in Huck Finn where Huck and Jim were talking about stuff. And Huck would be like, well, you don't understand, and Jim would be like, I think I do.
Yeah.
And it just feels a little bit like, these kind of innocents abroad, to I guess stick with the Twain thing there for a second.
Well, I want to say there's a needle you have to thread there, because I agree with you that it's ridiculous on its face to say it doesn't matter in the least what a men's views are. That there's all kinds of reasons to deplore that statement. All kinds of human rights violations, as you pointed out, get opened up because of it. On the other hand, I mean, I do think there's a needle to thread there, because I think there is some wisdom in the complaint you will hear sometimes in the non-extreme case, right? The case that is not Nuremberg, where, people will sometimes say, damn, like, it kind of sucks that people, like constantly talk about politics now.
Right.
And, it's like the common cathedrals, like ball games or bowling alleys or dance halls or concerts, like bonding over that stuff, some people will argue, has gotten so much more difficult. And it doesn't come down to whether you're a fun guy to have a beer with, or whether you're fun to go out dancing with. It all comes down to whether you agree about, who should be elected president or whatever. And that does get, tiresome when somebody's only about their views. I mean, that's what Settembrini is. So, to me, I feel like, there's got to be a balance here. Like, I don't think Joachim is right, but I absolutely don't think that Settembrini is right either, And so I think there's got to be something else going on, something midway.
Yeah, well, and I think pretty clearly this is the thing that the book is struggling with. I'm going to be very shocked if we get to the end of this novel and it doesn't feel like this is the question that either is answered or not.
Yeah.
It's some version of how do we live in the world with other people?
Yeah.
Do we do it by going up to a mountain and just kind of like sleepily going from meal to meal and maybe occasionally, meet pretty girls?
Yeah.
Do we stay down in the valley and build boats and sleepily go from day to day and maybe occasionally meet pretty girls?
Yeah.
What's the, is there really a
Do we
difference?
fight for ideas
Right.
in some
Yeah.
ways?
Yeah, or are we just doing this kind of daily thing, I suppose? Is there a big picture?
Well, and I would add further that Joachim's statement is rendered more absurd by the time in which Thomas Mann is writing this, because he's writing this in the aftermath of World War I, which was just so cataclysmic. And I think, there are a lot of criticisms you could levy on World War I, but I feel like one of the most salient would be that was an example of, on a en masse scale, everyone feeling like they were doing their duty.
Right.
Like untangling who was right and wrong in the fullness of time through history, it all looks pretty freaking ridiculous, World War I does,
Right.
as just an enterprise that killed so many people. And it was out of a sense of duty and allegiance and entangling, what do they call it in high school, entangling alliances. So what Joachim's thinking literally got like a lot of people killed from Mann's perspective, even before World War II.
Right. Yeah, and the ridiculousness of that is something that, that people are already kind of thinking about. And I think there's to some degree, right, people like Mon were saying, like, this is the fault of these policymakers, of these philosophers,
Yeah.
you know. But we also see towards the really the very end of today's reading, Hans gives a response to this, right?
Mhm.
And he says, all this confusion must be reconciled. And if you don't think so, right, if you don't think we have a responsibility to
Yeah.
make all this fit together,
Yeah.
why then you're dividing the world up into two hostile camps, which I may tell you is a grievous error. And I think this is an interesting reversal. I honestly don't know yet what I think about this.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, it feels like Hans is being, I don't know if naive is the right word or disingenuous, but he is essentially saying to Hans, if you don't want to figure this out, then it's your fault,
Right.
that people are going to be mad at each other and we're going to fight wars again.
Right.
Which I think is just really a crazy perspective on this.
Yeah.
But then if we expand out and say,
It becomes more true when
we
you
say,
start.
you know, yeah, at some point we've got to reconcile this. But I just don't, and maybe it's the moment I'm in,
Yeah.
right? But I find this idea of, you know, the solution being reconciling ideas, like this whole like compromise thing, as you know, a lot of people are sort of talking about in politics now. And what I find is the most uncompromising people seem to be the ones saying, you know, well, the problem is the other side won't compromise.
That's right.
You know, the people who basically create a situation where, they're like I think you shouldn't exist, but I'll meet you in the middle.
Right.
You know,
Right.
What's the middle?
Yeah.
What's the middle between like I'm a human being and I don't think you should exist? And I know that's not exactly what Mon's doing, but it feels to me like Hans has already taken this kind of lofty position where he's willing to just run with these ideas, sort of like Settembrini, sort of like Naphtha, sort of like I do when I get into whatever bad idiom.
Yeah.
But he's willing to run with these ideas as not only the most important thing, but kind of like the only thing.
Yeah.
And on some level, I feel like Joachim is like, I don't know, man. Like, will the dude give me a jump when my car's dead?
Yeah.
You know? And so, and I know that there are flaws with that.
Definitely.
But it does feel like this bit of reading, this 40 or 50 pages that we've kind of covered here, most of which I will acknowledge we just kind of like glossed over because there wasn't anything to say about it.
Right.
But it feels like what it introduced for me to the book is this idea that these relationships are problematic, and they're all problematic in kind of similar ways.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to see what the rest of Chapter 6 does, and I guess, Chapter 6 is yet another